Star Wars Rogue Squadron 3 Rebel Strike is the third game in the Rogue Squadron series. It's the sequel to Rogue Leader, which came out for the GameCube a couple years ago when the system launched. The previous game was kind of a showcase for the GameCube because it was really powerful graphically. It had progressive scan support, it had Dolby Pro Logic 2. So it was basically kind of a sensory tour de force for the GameCube when it came out. This new game has a lot to live up to in terms of both presentation and gameplay. And it's a pretty solid package overall. The developer Factor 5 has added quite a bit of new gameplay elements to beef up the experience that players had in the last game. Some of the new gameplay stuff is a little hit or miss, but for the most part, Rebel Strike is a pretty solid package for fans of action games and Star Wars. If you played the last game, Rogue Leader, you're going to be pretty familiar with the way the missions are set up in Rebel Strike. You've got a linear progression of stages that kind of loosely follows the plot lines from the original trilogy. Although the missions are actually set kind of around the movies, they take place mostly in areas that are referred to in like the Star Wars books and the card games, not so much actual sequences that you'll know from the movies. Unlike Rogue Leader, which gave you one set path through the game, Rebel Strike actually has two concurrent mission paths. One of them follows Luke Skywalker and the other follows his friend, the ace pilot Wedge Antilles. Each character has a unique mission path and you can switch between them at any time. So the previous Rogue Squadron games were all about vehicular combat, and that's still basically the case here. Vehicular combat was the name of the game in the last two Rogue Squadron games, and that's basically still the case here. You'll spend most of your missions piloting a lot of the familiar fighters from the Star Wars movies Okay. Like the X-Wing, the B-Wing, the Y-Wing, the Snowspeeder, that kind of thing. This time around, Factor 5 has also added ground vehicles in a few missions, such as the two-legged AT-ST Walker that you see in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. You can ride the speeder bike from the indoor scenes toward the end of Return of the Jedi in a few missions. And there are even a couple missions where you can drive the AT-AT, which is the giant four-legged walker from the Hoth sequences, although in those sequences you only really get to control the turrets. These new vehicles all play pretty well. It's kind of cool to get into the AT-ST and just go stomping around and step on stormtroopers and kind of blow up everything in the area. The other new gameplay type that Factor 5 has added in Rebel Strike is on-foot missions. You'll actually get out of your vehicles in some missions and run around on foot with a blaster rifle fighting stormtroopers and some other ground enemies. Of course, in theory, this sounds pretty cool, but unfortunately the execution is a little bit lacking. The auto-targeting in the on-foot sequences can be a little hard to deal with. It'll stick to the wrong enemy a lot of the time. But then again, sometimes it'll make it easy to wipe out a whole squad of stormtroopers without any effort on your part. The way the targeting works is basically that your crosshair will snap to whatever enemy you're looking toward, which means that if you want to move your crosshair to another enemy, you actually have to physically change the direction that you're running. And having the targeting and movement linked in this way really makes it difficult and awkward to get around and shoot the people that you want to shoot. Overall, it's nice that Factor 5 made an effort to put some new gameplay in Rebel Strike, but unfortunately the on-foot stuff really doesn't come together very well, and it would have been nice if they had just spent the extra time to make a few more vehicular missions. If you played Rogue Leader, you'll know that the core single-player campaign was only really about half of what the game had to offer. You could go back and play a lot of the missions again to win medals so that you could unlock a whole lot of extras. And the same thing is the case in Rebel Strike. You can win medals by replaying the missions and performing really well, and then you can cash your medals in to unlock a whole pile of extra missions, and there are several other trinkets that you can get as well. Whereas the game's required missions are generally based on original scenarios, the unlockable missions, for the most part, follow the more exciting sequences from the movies, like you'll play a mission where you escape from Cloud City with Chewbacca and Lando. There's a mission where you have to take on the Super Star Destroyer while you're fighting the second Death Star. So if you're looking to relive some of your favorite moments from the movies, you'll definitely find that in Rebel Strike as well. Thankfully, you'll still spend the majority of your time in vehicles, and the action there is just as solid as it ever was in Rogue Leader. The space and air combat plays about like you'd expect. You've still got the same tools at your disposal, like your targeting computer. You can go to the first-person cockpit mode. You've got your typical radar. So basically, if you played Rogue Leader, you know exactly what to expect out of the flight portions of Rebel Strike. There are a couple cool new gimmicks that they've added to the flight portions in Rebel Strike. There's one mission where you're fighting AT-ATs in a snowspeeder, but instead of having to use the same old move of just wrapping your tow cable around their legs and tripping them up, you can actually use your tow cable to pick up bombs that are on the ground and swing them into the AT-ATs. And there's another mission where you get to pilot the Jedi Starfighter that you saw in Episode 2. And you can even use those crazy sonic charges that Jango Fett used in the movie that make the big blue shockwave and kind of suck the sound out of the scene for a second. A lot of people looked at Rogue Leader as the game that you used to show off your GameCube when it was new, so With that in mind, Rebel Strike has a pretty big graphical legacy to live up to. The game does look very good, although obviously it's not the same leap that we saw from Rogue Squadron to Rogue Leader. Just about every mission and vehicle in Rebel Strike looks really good. With a couple of somewhat bland exceptions, the levels are really colorful and detailed and big. There's a lot of room to move around for the most part. All the ships and the familiar locations in the game look suitably Star Warsy. Everything looks like you'd expect it to, having seen the movies a million times. Some of the characters in the on-foot sequences are a little bit spotty, but for the most part everything looks nice and solid. For the most part, the action in Rebel Strike runs really smoothly. There are definitely places where you can tell it's not 60 frames a second, but the frame rate definitely never gets down to anything you would call bad. In audio terms, if you've seen the Star Wars movies, you should pretty much know what to expect out of Rebel Strike. Obviously, they're working with the same established library of sound effects that have been in use for about 20 years now. The voice acting is a little inconsistent. For instance, they've got a really good Darth Vader, but a not-so-good Han Solo. And surprisingly, they actually use a lot of original music in this game, although it's not quite up to the standard of the John Williams score. Rebel Strike already has a lot of replay value because you can go back and replay the missions to unlock new stuff. And there's actually a huge amount of two-player content in the game as well. The biggest bonus feature is that you can actually play through the entire single-player campaign in Rogue Leader as a co-op game. You're not actually getting Rogue Leader for free because you can't play through the game by yourself, but if you have a friend and you want to take it on, it's actually a pretty new experience to play the game cooperatively. The mission difficulty in Rogue Leader has actually been rebalanced to accommodate 2 players. There are a lot more TIE fighters in some missions, it's just a lot harder. And they've also made some aesthetic upgrades to the game as well. So with the addition of this cooperative Rogue Leader, you're actually getting kind of 2 games in one. When you get down to it, Rebel Strike is a pretty solid action game, especially if you're a Star Wars fan. The stuff that Factor 5 got right in Rogue Leader, they obviously got right again here. Some of the ideas that they tried this time around didn't really work out so well, but at least they did try to implement some new gameplay features. Rebel Strike has a lot of gameplay variety and a ton of replay value. So if you're a Star Wars fan and a fan of action games, you should definitely at least give it a look.